From sourcing lethal injection drugs to moratoriums, today's bill shows that the death penalty is anything but settled. Welcome back to Beyond the Bill Number, the podcast where we prove that legislation is never just paperwork. It's politics, process, and sometimes firing squads.
Yes. Nothing like easing into an episode with a sentence that mentions firing squads.
Yes, today, surprise, surprise, we're talking about the death penalty. Not in the abstract, but in the very real, very procedural way that states are rewriting how capital punishment works in 2026. Before we get into stuff today, let's just take a gander at the death penalty from a global perspective. I know that we've talked a little bit about this before we started recording, but 12 years ago for Bill Track 50, I did a post about the death penalty. And I remember beforehand, I was pro-death penalty. I was like, oh yeah, if somebody murders somebody, murder them back, tit for tat, that seems fair.
Yeah.
Then I did all of this research and I was like, you know what? Actually, this is terrible and we should absolutely not do it. And back at this time was when James Holmes, the movie theater shooter in Colorado, was about to go up for his trial. And I found out that for his trial, it would have costed like 5 times more to try to convict him for the death penalty than just give him life in prison. Just that alone, the taxpayer burden, doesn't really seem worth it to me, especially when you take into account wrongful convictions and all of the drama behind this, and in the US, racism behind this. It's a pretty messy area to even look into.
Yes, it really is. And obviously we will talk about how the US is an outlier here, that most countries in the Western world got rid of the death penalty quite some time ago. And it is one of those things about America that foreigners just find shocking, really, that you still do this. And particularly, we're going to look at the various methods that are used as well, which are often sort of quite horrific. We really don't get it. So let's just take a slightly broader look then. So which countries in the world actually execute the most numbers of their own citizens? Well, people probably wouldn't be surprised to hear that China is number one. No one knows quite how many, but it's in the thousands per year that they execute. They execute a lot, way more than anyone else. Number 2, you have Iran. We obviously know exactly what's going on in Iran now. So not only do they tend to kill protesters in the streets, but they actually convict people and execute large numbers of people as well for a whole variety of different offences. Then number 3 is Saudi Arabia, which again is quite a well-known state for sort of being very harsh in terms of punishment and executing quite large numbers of people. You then have Iraq, which surprised me actually. I think that's a recent addition to this list. Quite recently started executing quite a lot of people. And then the next country in that list is the US, of course. So as you can see, you're keeping very good company there. In Europe, there's only one country which actually executes anyone, and that's Belarus.
Okay.
So, as you might expect, really. So, any of those countries surprise you?
No, I do think Iran probably went into first place for 2026, given what they did in January to their citizens.
Yes, but I don't think that counts as the death penalty, though, does it?
Yeah, I mean, that's true. The executing in the streets must be different than the death penalty. It really isn't that surprising. It's sad that we're went 5th. That's pretty crazy. Yes. Especially because I do feel like here that the death penalty is not as prevalent as it was. And there's a lot of states here that still have it on the books, but they're not actively executing people. So the most surprising to me is that we're 5th still, because I kind of thought that we had maybe
dropped down a bit. Well, that is, I think it's about 25 people a year, something like that. It's 20. It's about 20 people a year. Whereas obviously, as we said, China is thousands. The other countries tend to be many hundreds, if not thousands of people. So there is a slightly difference of scale here. But it's still number 5. Now, in the UK, we haven't executed anybody since 1964. That was our last execution. We executed 2 people who murdered a hotel owner. After that, it was actually suspended, and it wasn't actually abolished until 1998, which I think was a response to the EU, because if you're a member of the EU, you're not allowed to have the death penalty. It's one of the rules. And so I think the EU insisted that we actually take it off the statute books. Now, of course, that we're not in the EU, it does raise a prospect. There's no reason for us not to bring it back, given how right-wing our politics are shifting and how right-wing, so quite extreme right-wing parties are becoming very popular. It is a definite prospect thing. It's interesting to ask then, how popular exactly is the death penalty? Well, in Britain, they do regular surveys where they ask people questions. And it is one of these things that's very difficult to survey, because if you ask different questions, then you get very different answers. So if you ask the question, just a bold question, do you think the death penalty should be legal? You get a different answer than if you say, do you think child rapist murderers should be executed? Obviously, it's one of those ones where you have to be really careful with your questions. But being careful with the questions, you still get roughly 50% of people in the UK would back reinstatement of the death penalty for certain crimes under certain circumstances, which I find quite shocking and quite horrifying. I'm very opposed to the death penalty, and it's a medieval punishment. Going back like that is terrible. What are we going to do next? Bring back the ducking stool? Are we going to start burning witches again? It's like, for me, in my mind, it's a similar type of thing. So the fact that half the people in Britain actually support the death penalty, I find quite horrifying. So what do you think the number is in the US? Broadly, across the whole of the country, what percentage of people do you think actually support the death penalty?
I mean, I would think that it's over 50%. And I think that a lot of people's support in it is due to a general lack of understanding and information about it. But
So the figure I found online, again, lots of different questions. There's lots of different answers to this question. How popular is it? The figure I found was 53%, which is a historic low, apparently. So the popularity of the death penalty has been declining in the US for quite some time. But obviously, it's very different geographically. So different states will give you very different answers, and politically. So which party do you think is more likely to support the death penalty? Republicans or Democrats?
I do think it's the Republicans.
It is. And it's very stark as well, the difference in terms of levels of support for the death penalty. As we see, it is obviously mainly sort of Republican, very, very red states that actually still exercise the death penalty. So yeah, it's interesting. It's a really thorny issue. And all over the world, even in those countries where they couldn't possibly imagine having the death penalty, if you actually ask people whether they want to bring it back, about half of the people will. But when you get into the practicalities of it, then the popularity tends to decline a little bit. You say, okay, how are we going to do that then? Should we hang them? Should we electrocute them? Firing squad? Should we poison them? Once you start asking those kinds of questions, people start thinking, oh, actually, that sounds a bit unpleasant. No, maybe we shouldn't really bring that back.
It's a really kind of jarring thing in general when you think about the processes that they put in place. I know that there's one where you get a sedative first and they check to see if the sedative has worked and they say your name, and if you don't respond, they caress your eyelashes to see if your eyes move, which is just kind of a tender thing to do to somebody right before you're killing them.
There's the actual physical harm that states do work very hard to diminish, even the states that do execute people. I think it's unconstitutional, cruel and unusual punishment, all of that. So they have to focus on making it as painless as possible. But that ignores the psychological harm, because people are on death row for years and years and years. And can you imagine being under the death penalty for years, never knowing whether maybe, my latest appeal's going to fail and next week I could be strapped into a chair and electrocuted to death or something for years, having that hanging over you. I mean, that is torture. That's like cruel and unusual, as I could say. I mean, there's an argument to say if you're going to execute someone, you should do it as quickly as possible. But then, of course, you need to be sure that they are actually guilty. And so you do need to let the legal processes go through. So I think just one of the strongest arguments against the death penalty is exactly that. You shouldn't be torturing people for years by putting them on death row.
And also, you don't actually know how torturous the things that we're doing to people are or are not. There's a scientific approach, of course, to try to prove that it's not harming somebody, but you don't know. Somebody could have an allergy and it could be excruciating. You have no idea what any of the methods actually can do unless you were the person getting killed that way, and then you wouldn't be able to tell anyone because you were dead.
So the few people who survive these methods, occasionally things go terribly wrong and people survive, and afterwards they can actually explain what they've been through, and those are harrowing stories about the pain and the suffering that they go through.
I think it's time to dig into the legislation.
So it's one of those issues where you can't just ask, is the death penalty legal? You have to ask, does the state actually know how to carry it out?
Yeah, which brings us to Indiana. And a bill that technically got more yes votes than no votes, but it still failed. So, Stephen, I'm confused here. Walk us through Indiana House Bill 1119, because this is procedural chaos at its absolute finest.
Yes, it is, isn't it? We love this kind of stuff. So on January the 28th, 2026, Indiana House Bill 1119 failed on its third reading with a vote of 48 yes votes to 47 nay votes. So on paper, that does look like a win. More yes votes than no votes.
But Indiana doesn't play simple majority games, does it?
No, no, of course it doesn't. Indiana's constitution requires a constitutional majority, meaning 51 votes in a 100-member House, no matter how many people are absent or not voting. And obviously, there were some not voting members this time round. So 48 votes wasn't enough. So the bill was narrowly defeated. And that narrow defeat does really illustrate the controversial and polarizing nature of the debate around this, and obviously the publicity that it attracted as well.
And what was this bill actually doing?
Well, this is where it's interesting. So you hear a lot of debates around bills, and you hear a lot of debates, particularly around bills to do with the death penalty. But this one was unusual in that this bill would have added the firing squad as an authorized method of execution in Indiana. Yes, a firing squad. Importantly, supporters framed it as an operational fix. It wasn't a philosophical expansion of the death penalty. You're not changing the circumstances under which the death penalty would be applied or anything like that. It was purely a practical method to get around the problems they were having with other methods of execution.
Yes, and I have heard murmurings on the internet that some people would rather just get shot than the whole process of getting injected with chemicals or whatever it is. So the argument here was essentially we already have the death penalty. We just can't execute anyone reliably. And what's more reliable than a gun?
Yes, exactly. And that's how the author, Representative Jim Lucas, actually framed it. Lethal injection drugs are hard to obtain. Protocols are constantly litigated, and states are stuck with death sentences that they just can't carry out.
The opposition was not so subtle.
No, they weren't subtle at all, as tends to happen with these kind of debates. So some lawmakers opposed the bill because of the method itself, calling it barbaric. Others raised classic death penalty objections. What about wrongful convictions? What about the fact that it's irreversible if you want to change your mind later on? What about the moral legitimacy of our nation executing its own citizens anyway?
And so was this more of them saying we want to start killing people and we haven't been able to because of the rigmarole of trying to get these drugs? And so they were trying, because like I said, a lot of states still have death penalties on the books. They still have people that were convicted, but they just haven't killed anybody in forever. And I just kind of thought that was because states were like, this isn't great. But Indiana is kind of telling us, no, it's because we simply can't and we want to.
Yes, that's right. So it mentioned about the difficulty of getting hold of the drugs. That's because most companies refuse to sell their drugs to states if they're going to be used for executions, obviously, because it's a bad look. So they deliberately write those into contracts. You are not allowed to use our medications to actually execute people. And it's a real problem. So they can't get them. And there's issues with the various other methods as well. So they said, well, let's just start shooting people instead.
Okay. And notably, this wasn't partisan.
No, that's the key takeaway. Indiana, obviously a very red state. It's a Republican trifecta, but 19 Republicans joined all of the Democrats to vote no on this. So, and you can see that clearly. Just pull the bill up on Bill Track 50 and you can click the votes tab and you can see the breakdown there.
Wow, that's really interesting. And Indiana is one bill, but zooming out, where does the U.S. actually stand on the death penalty right now?
Okay, so legally you have 27 states that still have the death penalty, but in practice, far fewer actually use it. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, which has a wealth of information on this, if you are interested in this topic, I would very much advise you to actually go and read what they have there. Executions are very heavily concentrated in a small group of states. If you look at the blog I wrote on this, there's actually a list with how many they execute. Texas, way out in front there, and it counts for more than a third of all executions since 1976.
Okay. So in a lot of states, the death penalty exists more as a statute than a punishment.
Exactly. And as we mentioned, internationally, the US is increasingly isolated. In fact, among all Western democracies, only the US and Japan still actively retain capital punishment. And Japan executes quite a lot of people as well. Actually, they're hot on the heels of the US.
Let's get into the legislation itself. You tracked 44 death penalty related bills across 19 states. What are the patterns that jumped out?
Well, the bills tend to fall into 5 main categories. So first of all, you straight up abolition bills, of course. Then interestingly, you also had a lot of bills that were trying to reinstate the death penalty in states where it isn't used. Then you had a lot of bills around execution methods and protocols, like the one that we've just looked at. Then you have some to do with oversight and witness rules. So what kind of processes have to take place before, who's allowed to actually watch the executions. And then moratorium saying, let's just, let's put it on pause for a while. Abolition though, is by far the largest bucket.
Okay, let's start there then with abolition.
Yes, 22 of these bills would abolish or repeal the death penalty. In deep red states, these tend to be Democratic message bills, like Alabama's HB 76, very unlikely to pass, but designed to keep innocence cost and racial disparity in the conversation around the death penalty.
But Pennsylvania's different.
Yeah, Pennsylvania, interestingly, has bipartisan abolition bills. You've got HB 99, HB 888, which changes the math slightly. So bipartisan sponsorship, of course, turns abolition from symbolic into an actual real possibility.
And Delaware?
Yeah, so Delaware's HB 35 is especially notable. It proposes a constitutional amendment, and it's already passed the Senate. Of course, as we know, constitutional changes take time. They usually have to go through voter approval. A lot of them will actually fall before the final hurdle.
All right. So now the counter movement.
Yes. So you have states like Illinois, New Jersey, New Hampshire. They all have bills attempting to reinstate capital punishment. And these, as you might expect, are often sponsored by the minority party.
Okay, so more, again, signaling than legislating, just opposite.
Yes, absolutely. This is really big with these types of bills. Bills about the death penalty really do tend to be those signaling bills rather than things that are actually attempted to get stuff done. But West Virginia is different. So you have bills like HB 2019 and SB 196. They would reintroduce the death penalty in an overwhelmingly Republican legislature. So that really does give reinstatement a more realistic path.
Okay, and so what about Texas's HB 4661?
Well, that one narrows eligibility to the killing of law enforcement or first responders. So this is a politically strategic worst of the worst framing. And you do see a lot of these kind of bills, really. If you want to justify the death penalty and actually maintain it, then you choose really, really bad crimes and say we're only going to actually have it for that.
Okay, I can see that approach, I guess. So let's look at the bills that are dealing with the actual methods of execution. This kind of feels like where a lot of the real action is.
Yes, that's right. Actually making a big change like getting rid of the death penalty or reinstating, very, very hard to do. But tweaking with the ways that it's actually carried out is a sort of continuous process, really. So states, as we've mentioned, are really struggling with lethal injection, which was the most popular method and is the method that's often seen as the most humane for some reason. I'm not quite sure why, because it isn't in any way. But they struggle because they can't get a hold of the drug. So they are exploring alternatives. And so you've got Arizona's SB 1751 and SCR, sort of continuing resolution there, 1049, that revisit authorized methods. You've got Nebraska's LB 432, which is trying to expand flexibility around methods. Ohio, their bill HB 36 would add nitrogen hypoxia as a method. And this is increasingly a method that's sort of being touted as being sort of more humane than other methods as well. Supposedly, if you breathe in a lot of nitrogen, then you just go to sleep and you die. But as with all things, there are questions around that. Tennessee, you've got HB 1022, SB 0491, and they focus on different types of injection drugs that you can use.
And so this is where Indiana's House Bill 1119 fits squarely.
Yes, and its failure shows that even pro-death penalty states can balk when the mechanisms become too visible. In a lot of ways, as we said, perhaps a firing squad is actually a more humane way to do it than injecting people with poison. It's quick, over in a second, but when you get into the practicalities of who exactly is going to pull that trigger, how does it work, and just the sort of the visceral nature of that, it really sort of turns people off. So even legislators, I'm sure, would say that they are very, very much pro-death penalty. I think pretty much have to be to get elected in that state. They voted against it because they just said no, it's a step too far.
Yeah, I mean, I know the firing squad aspect of it is supposed to keep whoever had the kill shot anonymous, but there's interesting parts there. Okay, so what about bills that are focused on watching the process? Because that's kind of what I was thinking about when this firing squad situation came up.
He would want to watch. It feels quite ghoulish at first. It's like, really, do people actually want to watch this? But actually, when you think about it, witnessing this is actually really, really important to make sure that processes are carried out correctly and so on. So Tennessee's SB 1214 would expand who's allowed to witness execution. So that would include legislators could actually go along. Very good idea. And Oklahoma's SB 1978 focuses on verification standards. This is making sure that the execution is actually carried out correctly and to the letter.
All right, so these are not the flashiest of the bills we've talked about today, but they do matter.
Yes, absolutely. And they reveal where the lawmakers really feel this pressure. Legitimacy, is it an actually legitimate thing for us to be doing? Transparency. So it's like saying, we're not hiding this away, and making sure that you keep public trust.
And there's only one moratorium bill, right?
Yes, that's right. In Oklahoma, the SB 601, moratoriums are politically awkward because they sort of admit uncertainty without resolving it. So it's a bit of an issue, really, I think, getting these kind of bills passed.
But they do reframe the debate.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as we said, a lot of these is just about having the debate, having the actual discussion, and you can move it from like the questions of morality to reliability and actually rehearse all of the arguments.
Yeah. I think those are some of the big reasons why I changed my tune all of those years ago.
Absolutely.
So we're kind of heading towards abolition or just more legislative gridlock?
Yes, it would be nice. I think particularly both of us agree that the US would be a nicer place if we didn't have the death penalty. But that isn't really the way it's going. Certainly not from the evidence, not the evidence of these bills as well. So what you're probably looking at is just more divergence, really. So some states stepping away, some others freezing it in place, and a smaller group of states, an increasingly smaller group of states, I would think, spending enormous energy to try and keep executions feasible.
All right. So Indiana's 48-47 vote is essentially the perfect symbol here.
Yes, it is actually. It is because you've got a state where, yes, they support the death penalty, and yet it still manages to fail, even though the vote was actually won. So I think that is sort of a symbolic, really. The death penalty has enormous political power, and in many countries, well, even countries that don't have the death penalty, that haven't had it for a long time, it's a hugely emotive issue with political power, and the details of how to carry it out are powerful enough to fracture coalitions, and often the reason why, even though there's lots of countries and states in the US that would actually say, yeah, maybe we should bring it back. When you start looking into those technicalities of it, it's just too difficult to come up with a way that can be done that would meet like humanitarian concerns and everything else.
Yeah. And if you want to track any of these bills, abolition, reinstatement, or execution methods, you can follow every vote, every amendment, and every committee stop on BillTrack50.com.
Absolutely, because sometimes the most important outcome isn't whether a bill passes, but why it fails.
Thanks for listening to Beyond the Bill Number. Like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time with another bill that reminds us that the fine print is really where the story lives or dies.